Bem-vindos ao podcast Caos Planejado, seu programa sobre cidades. Hoje vamos conversar com Shlomo Angel. Shlomo, ou Soli, como apelido, fez graduação e doutorado em Planejamento Urbano e Regional na Universidade da California, em Berkeley. Ele é professor de Planejamento de Cidades no Marron Institute da NYU, a New York University, e lidera os projetos da NYU Urban Expansion e o NYU Stern Urbanization Project. Ele é especialista em políticas de desenvolvimento urbano, tendo aconselhado as Nações Unidas, o Banco Mundial e o BID, o Banco Interamericano de Desenvolvimento. Ele é autor de um dos meus livros favoritos sobre desenvolvimento urbano, chamado Planet of Cities, ou Planeta de Cidades, e atualmente foca na documentação e no planejamento da expansão urbana no mundo em desenvolvimento. Essa é a primeira entrevista sendo conduzida em inglês, aqui no Caos Planejado, mas publicaremos a transcrição traduzida dessa entrevista e disponibilizaremos no nosso site. Soli, thank you very much for being here with us today, and welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
So Soli, you recently published a working paper called The Anatomy of Density. What is the aim of this research, and why the importance of studying urban population density in urban planning?
Well, Anthony, as you know, there's always been a great interest in density in cities, and part of that interest is because density can be measured. And we know from experience that when something can be measured, it gets more attention than things that cannot be measured. So density and the study of density has been with us since the early 1950s, where when Colin Clark published his famous paper on urban population densities, when he showed that density declines exponentially with distance from the city center. And since then, there have been numerous papers confirming this result. He also said, presented some data that over time, that curve becomes flatter as densities in the periphery go up and density in the center go down. And this has also been with us for a long time. What we haven't studied for a very long time until I started about 10, 15 years ago to do it is to show what happens to densities in cities over time. And the reason for the interest in that is that it appears that density are declining in cities on average over time. And that is a concern for a number of reasons. First, because lower densities imply that more land is converted to urban use, more rural land, more good agricultural land, more forest land is being converted to urban use, and kind of conservationists would like to see less of it. When densities are lower, it means that infrastructure lines are longer. Municipal governments have to invest more in roads and water supply and sanitation than they would if the city was denser. Also, trips are longer when densities decline. So you can imagine that a city that is half as dense as another one, distances are, like the square root of 2 longer, like they are 40% longer. And therefore, vehicular miles are longer. The number of miles traveled, the number of kilometers traveled is longer, which also means more energy is being expended and more greenhouse gases are being let out. So that higher density is also good for mitigation of climate change. So you have, and also higher density makes it possible for more people to walk, for more people to bike, and also above a certain threshold, higher densities are also better for public transport. So the higher density, which is again more environmentally friendly than the car. So there are many calls for an increase in density. And also you can imagine that an increase in density means that more people can live closer to everybody else rather than further away. They can be closer to jobs, they can be closer to markets, closer to school. So this whole idea of a city, which is to have more people being closer to each other, the whole idea of urbanization, you might let's say, where urbanization is basically the decision of people to move from being closer to the land to being closer to each other. And being closer to each other, that means density. And the higher that density is, the better cities are able to function and the more productive they are and the more sustainable they are. That is why there is so much interest in density. That said, there are also downsides to density, which we need to be careful about.
So, Soli, today in Brazil, one of the main current trends, let's say, in urban planning that was implemented in the São Paulo master plan is what we call transit-oriented development, or TOD. So to explain our listeners, it's the main thesis is to only allow density increases where there is or where there will be mass transit infrastructure. So in São Paulo right now, there are some sites in the central business area that are, say, 2 or 3 blocks away from a transit station, and therefore outside the range, let's say, of mass transit that have a very low floor area ratio, while other sites, sometimes close to the urban edge, have a very high floor area ratio because they are close to this mass transit infrastructure, trying to, let's say, plan density around these corridors. What are your thoughts on transit-oriented development and this type of density planning?
This is a good question. I think that when you have a city that is already built, like São Paulo, the city is going to continue to grow, right? It's going to continue to grow with an increase in population and an increase in income. Both require more floor space. So when you have more people, you need more dwelling units, you need more floor space. When you have higher income, people that lived in a smaller apartment want to live in a larger apartment. You have bigger schools, bigger stores, bigger offices. So both of these effects, the population effect and the income effect, create demand for floor space. And that demand for floor space can be fulfilled basically in 3 ways. One, by building more on the urban periphery, which is further away and which like I said before, converts rural land to urban land. That's one way. That's urban expansion. The other way, which is densification, can happen in 2 ways. It can happen by infill, like filling in all the vacant lands. In São Paulo, very little that can be an infill because there's very little vacant land that is left within the footprint of São Paulo. And it can be done. It's very much, when you talk about densification, when you look at the role of government in densification, government usually holds down densities, so government is usually against densification. Namely, the zoning rules say you cannot build more than this, right? So we are restricting densification. So in a way, if you want to densify, you have to remove the restrictions. I mean, you cannot ask a developer to build a 20-story building where there's no demand for that kind of building. So developers are going to respond to demand. The government only needs to remove the restraints on development. And then what you're saying, the transit-oriented density is kind of like selective removal of the regulations to allow for more construction. It may be improving the infrastructure in these areas which have transit-oriented development. I think this is a very good idea, but I don't think that this is something that should be the only way to densify. I think you should densify in all ways. You should densify areas away from public transit, area next to public transit. You should basically allow the demand to dictate how dense places need to be. That is my overall response to that. I don't think, urban planners tend to think that they can actually, draw something and then somebody goes and makes it. It's not like that. All we do is we do what the public sector does. The public sector does only very few things. It manages property rights. It manages the banking sector with the mortgages and construction loans. It manages subsidies and taxes. It manages infrastructure, and it manages the regulatory environment. These are the 5 things that the public sector does, right? The public sector doesn't build, at least in the majority of countries. So among those 5 things, the things that matter here for densification are the infrastructure and the regulation. And I think that the most important one in most of the places where I look into is the regulation. And the regulations tend to restrict densities rather than to make densification possible. So the TOD idea that you have there is some pressure on the regulatory agencies to be be more generous when it comes to allowing densification.
Yes, my understanding of the, let's say, rationale behind TOD is that planners will say, well, we cannot densify certain areas because there isn't enough infrastructure, right? And we will not be able to serve that density increase. But what at least I see happening in big cities in Brazil is that you get informal settlements somewhere else that are even more difficult to serve with infrastructure. Do you think that's a correct assessment of
Again, what I'm saying, Anthony, is the density is a market outcome. It's not a planning outcome. The planning outcome on density is the ceiling. But you cannot have, it's very difficult to have a kind of a minimum density to say to a developer, you can build here, but only if you build more than X. It's generally, developers will only build what they think they can sell. And what you're saying is, which is very true, and that is the densities in a lot of the favelas are very high. And we don't have to talk about densification there, but what we can do is talk about more construction. So in some place, some of the favelas, like 5-6 stories buildings, and some of them are only 1 or 2 story buildings. So I mean, we can definitely densify there. The question there is, and that is a very important challenge, is to bring in the services. Mm-hmm. And I think that in a way, the transit-oriented development idea puts the cart before the horse. We already have a high density development. We need to bring in the transit. Instead of saying, we have the transit here, let's have transit-oriented development there. So I think it's much more critical to bring good services to high density residential areas like favelas than to say we only allow high density where there happen to be transit stations.
Perfect. Excellent explanation. Thank you. Solly, going back to your paper, The Anatomy of Density, you talk about in this paper of different density categories and let's say factors or elements that can allow the increase of density. As you mentioned, building higher buildings, right, to use more of urban land. But one of the variables you talk about is plot coverage. And here in Brazil, there is a lot of criticism in increasing plot coverage in regards to protecting urban drainage systems. So Brazilian cities are frequently victims of urban flooding disasters, and the increase in plot coverage is usually, if not always, mentioned as one of the main culprits of these drainage problems. However, as we know, in many informal settlements, these rules are not frequently obeyed. So my question is, how much is plot coverage control either a viable policy for urban drainage or even an effective policy on urban drainage? And what are the, let's say, what are the concerns around increasing or decreasing this metric?
This is a very interesting question because the idea of low plot coverage, just to explain to people who are not familiar with that, is that when we have land that is still soil and vegetation, when it rains, it can absorb a lot of water. And when it's paved with concrete or when there's a roof there, then it can't absorb anything. And all the water that comes down has to be taken somewhere. So therefore, in a way, these green areas, you might say, provide storage, temporary storage for rainwater. And that is the reason that when there is heavy rain, places that have a lot of green areas don't flood, and places that don't have any green areas flood or have to get rid of a lot of water. So that's the general picture. Now, in terms of costs and benefits, which these people don't really care about, and that is they only care about, we need more drainage, right? So leave half the area green. That would be wonderful, right? So, but the cost of leaving half the area green, that never comes into play because they're not economists. They are ecologists or environmentalists or what have you, and they don't particularly care about what it means. And to me, I think that when you think about the amount of storage that a green area provides during a rainstorm, it's really minimal. It's not something that would be worth not being able to house, a population because we insist on keeping those area green to prevent flooding. So I think that when you're talking about increased plot coverage, and the proof is exactly in the informal settlements in the favelas where there is no green area. There are not very large green areas, and they house a lot of people. So they provide a lot of housing, a lot of affordable housing at the cost of, being flooded which is relatively low cost compared to the benefit that they generate with their housing. So what I'm saying to you is here, I agree that lower plot coverage make it easier for drainage, but I do not agree that that is a killer argument that would be say, drainage, okay, we lift our hands, we leave it like that. That there has to be some cost-benefit analysis that says, okay, we can house twice the number of people in this neighborhood on the open space, and then it would be more subject to flooding, or we have to take care of the drainage. Is it worth it? So what I'm saying is there's a calculus there that needs to be taken into account, rather than just saying, oh, that's terrible because it's bad for drainage.
Got it. Very clear. And thank you for that explanation. And Solly, in your writing, you have also been a critic of so-called containment strategies, right? So urban growth boundaries, green belts strategies. Urban planners argue many times actually to densify urban areas. In Brazil, this is implemented usually through the separation between urban and rural zones. So there are many urban planners and environmentalists today that try to, let's say, protect rural areas from sprawl. And actually, in practice, there is political and economic pressure from landowners in these urban fringes to develop these areas into subdivisions. And many times, this happens irregularly, or let's say through municipal corruption, right? So politicians convert rural areas into urban to benefit some landowner. So this is seen not only as an environmental problem, but as a corruption problem. So there are two, let's say, narratives behind this issue. Can you tell us what are the actual effects of these policies, and eventually how could this be dealt with in Brazil, maybe bringing some benchmarks from other cities around the world?
Yes, Anthony, you are right. I've been a critic of containment policies and of urban growth boundaries and of zoning regulations that separate the urban from the rural, or that mandate restrictions on the number of building permits that would be issued, the different tools that restrict urban expansion. And the reason I've been against containment is that the people who are in favor of containment are not sufficiently aware of the operation of real estate markets. The people who preach containment, I'm repeating myself, are not sufficiently aware of the operation of real estate markets. So they're saying, okay, let's contain. And then what happens to the need for more floor space? So, like I said, the need for more floor space comes from population pressure or from income pressure. So there's increased demand for floor space, right? There's a restricted supply. So how are we going to add supply, right? So if we can't add enough supply, all we see is an increase in prices. So what you're seeing is housing in places that have containment becomes less affordable. And this has been very well documented in England, for example, by Peter Hall, already back in the 70s when English cities were surrounded by green belts. It was very clear that it was having a very strong effect on housing affordability because you're restricting the land supply and you're not creating enough room. Okay. So my critique has been, okay, if you want to do containment, I'm not against containment if you can show me that you can make room through densification. And that anatomy of density story that we were talking about before is about telling you what you need to do to make room. So a lot of people are doing containment and then going and thinking about something else, but they're not telling us, okay, how are we going to deal with the demand? What kind of room are we going to make? Are we going to relax the regulations that allow for more plot coverage? taller buildings, smaller units, better rental arrangements that don't leave a lot of apartments empty, changing a lot of non-residential to residential use. You have to show me that you have enough room that you're creating for the demand for me to say it's okay to have containment. But usually you can't. So what it means is that you need expansion. In fact, we just completed a study which is going to be published soon called Densify and Expand, where we tried to measure what share of the population that was added to cities between 1990 and 2014 was added to their 1990 footprints, and what share was accommodated in expansion areas. In the world at large, a quarter of the population was accommodated within 1990 footprints, and 3/4 of the population was accommodated in expansion areas. It's not possible. And even the places that densified the most could not get more than half of the population accommodated in their existing footprints. So it's not possible. So this idea, and again, it's another kind of planning ideal. Let's stop the growth of cities. Right, fine. It just doesn't work. So because it doesn't work, what you see is exactly what you're mentioning. You're seeing people breaking the rules, either developers with connections in the municipalities or informal developers who don't care about the rules. And you see that instead of preparing the area on the periphery of the city for orderly expansion, what you do is you have selective expansion. And because you have selective expansion, you have speculation because it's only in a few places, so it has a lot of value. So instead of keeping the expansion area affordable, the expansion area is also not affordable because there's not enough of it. So that it becomes, like higher value than it needs to be. If there was more, it would be cheaper. So the reason that I'm against containment is because I'm for making room. And the reason that I'm for making room is that I'm for keeping cities affordable. And if you don't make enough room, then cities are no longer affordable. When you have a situation like San Francisco or New York that don't want to make room, then you have good jobs that cannot be filled because the people cannot afford to house themselves with access to these jobs. So there are calculations by American economists that several points of GDP are lost because of restrictions on the amount of construction that can take place in these cities which are desirable for economic development. So what you are doing is that this containment is not only bad because it makes housing unaffordable, it's also bad because the economy of the country suffers as a result. It has enormous consequences. It's an intervention in the economy that is really unproductive, unegalitarian, and because of that, also unsustainable from an environmental perspective. For these three reasons, I'm against containment. I'm for making room. So you want to make room by densification? Fine. You want to make room by expansion? Fine. But you got to make enough room. So if you can't make it inside, you have to make it outside. And if you can show me that you can make it inside, then fine. Then you can limit the amount of expansion outside. But otherwise, just saying, let's contain urban expansion, then forget about it, is an unacceptable policy.
Right. Is it too strong of a claim then to say that maybe sprawl is overrated usually as a negative consequence of urban expansion? Or what do you think about the whole discussion?
Yeah, look, I've worked for, a decade and a half to change the terminology in this field. And I think I've been successful. I mean, namely, there's more people talking about urban expansion than people that are talking about sprawl. Before, it was only sprawl. Sprawl, we don't want sprawl. Yeah, sprawl, it sounds like terribly negative. Like people, you sprawl on the bed, you sprawl. Sprawl is like not a very good thing, right? So the sprawl is generally low density development, okay, on the urban periphery. Okay, so first of all, we know that because of the density curve, density on the periphery is going to be lower anyway. Not only that, but fragmentation on the periphery is going to be higher. There's going to be a lot more open space because people think places fill up in a slower pace. So density on the periphery is going to be lower. Right. Now, the question is, again, in a capitalist society, what do you do if there's a demand for single-family homes with large plots of land, right? So, the rich want to live in low density with, large plots. Okay. Are you going to suggest that this is not allowed because it's sprawl? Or are you going to, and everybody should live in an apartment? So the question is whether you want to remove this choice. If you don't want to remove this choice, then you're going to have sprawl. Okay, so the only reason, I think, to complain about sprawl is to say, and that is in a capitalist perspective, right, is to say that the reason that we're against sprawl is because sprawl imposes additional costs on all of us, namely that it has externalities, namely that if you're building out there, that's fine, yeah, but we have to finance the roads, you're creating more greenhouse gases, you're taking over agricultural land and so on. All right. So what you are saying to me is that you have to internalize these costs. Namely, if you're traveling longer distances by car, we're going to tax you. We're going to have a gas tax, or we're going to have a carbon tax, so that if you are using the car for longer distances, you have to pay more. Or you have to pay for the infrastructure, for the increase in infrastructure. We're going to tax you more. So that I think you can do. And that is, you should think, instead of kind of crying about sprawl, you should think about market corrections that lead to higher densities, which is better infrastructure, higher gas taxes, regulations that invite transit-oriented development. And, instead of just saying, I don't like sprawl and therefore I'm going to contain cities so that they don't expand.
Interesting. Got it. Thank you. Solly, in this topic of decreasing floor area ratio and making room. In the last 5 years, many large Brazilian cities have been revising their master plans and sometimes increasing the allowed floor area ratio, but only through a charge, let's say. So in other words, FAR that is free in São Paulo was reduced, and the, let's say, additional FAR you can build in a lot, you have to pay for. Planners have frequently advocated this policy as a way to, let's say, redeem public infrastructure expenses that incentivize a price increase for these sites. I believe some cities in India or maybe Mumbai implement similar policy. So, what are your thoughts on this, and how to what extent does it affect housing affordability?
This is also an interesting question. I mean, first of all, my immediate reaction is I support the planners who want to increase the FAR, right? That's already good. So the idea that instead of saying that you can't increase the FAR, the idea that you say, yeah, I can increase the FAR is wonderful. And I'm all in favor of it. Now, in terms of paying for it, this is interesting because my experience, and I'll tell the story in a minute because it's a very good experience, is government is not very good at pricing. So when you say, I'm going to charge for it, okay, you're going to charge for it. How much are you going to charge for it? I don't know. I'm going to charge X. Why are you going to charge X? I don't know. So they don't really know how to do the calculation to know how much to charge for it. So in a way, you can think of it as property tax. So the property tax is automatic. Namely, if I build 3 stories, I pay $300 per property tax. I build 4 stories, I pay $400 property tax. 5 stories, $500. So I pay property tax so that floor space is taxed. And you build more floor space, you're taxed more. So that, I think, that we know how to do. So when you're saying I'm going to make you pay more for
build more, pay more to build more. Yeah,
I think that most developers would agree to pay. Why? Because they paid for the land based on 3 stories. Now you're saying I can build 5 stories. The value of the land increases. So it makes sense to ask for payment for the value of the land. So for me, when I think about it out loud, if you had a real property tax system, it would cover for that, right? It would just say, you're building more, it's worth more, I I tax you more in property tax. So the property tax for me is a little bit better tool, kind of better understood by everybody. You have more, it's worth more, you're going to be taxed more.
Yeah.
And so I'm all in favor of that. I want to tell you an interesting story about Israel. So in Israel sits, in the Jordan Valley. It's a kind of an earthquake zone. There's a crack that goes along the Jordan Valley that every 100 years or so there's an earthquake. And so the earthquake code was revised in 1980 to be stronger because the next earthquake should be coming soon. So all the buildings that were built before 1980 do not conform to the new earthquake regulations. So the government, and most of the buildings are 4-story walk-up apartment buildings, which are actually condominiums. So the government says, okay, how do I get those buildings to comply to the code? I'm going to give extra floor space for these buildings. I'm going to give, 1 or 2 more stories, and the people have to negotiate with all the people in the building. If they get agreement, the developer can build 2 stories more. And he also does the new infrastructure. He also installs an elevator and does the facade of the building again, and even increases the space of individual apartments by a room, like a security room, and so on. And so those regulations were put in place, and there was no reaction. There were no takers. No developers were taking this. So the government went into, why are they not taking this? He said, well, in all of these places, you need a consensus of all the people in the building. And if one objects and says, no, I won't do it. So we need to change the rule so that it's just majority rule, right? So they changed the rule and said 2/3 majority. If 2/3 majority agree, we can go ahead. So they said, okay, that's great. And then again, no takers. Why? Because it turns out that the value of the apartments is going to go up by $100,000. And according to the law, that's taxable. So if it's taxable, it's going to cost each owner $30,000. They don't have the money, so they can't agree. So the government changed the law again to say, okay, you don't have to pay tax on the increased value of that building, right? And so then you started to have developments, and then you started to have thousands of projects. And it started to work. So what I'm saying is when government gets involved with this kind of thing, they have to look at what the market is doing. If the response is too good, that means that they priced it too low. If the response is too high, that means that they priced it, that they have to increase the prices. So when government wants to get involved in these kind of things, it needs this kind of very flexible approach to see whether it works or doesn't work, and then adjust it accordingly. That is the lesson. But the additional lesson in Israel, when you measure it and when you talk to developers, it only works in areas where the cost per square meter of an apartment is more than $5,000. And any place where it's less than $5,000, no developer wants to go into it. So in a lot of these towns along the Jordan Valley where the earthquake danger is the highest, no developers. But in Tel Aviv, which is the furthest away and the least endangered, a lot of developers want to do it. So I'm only bringing this example to tell you that if the government wants to get involved in the real estate market, then first of all, it has to acquire the expertise of dealing with real estate, which urban planners don't have and are not interested in because they know better. They don't think they need to know about the market. And also, so they need the expertise. And the other thing that they need is they need the flexibility to say, okay, let's start with that, see what the response is, adjust the response so that we get the right outcome.
Perfect. I totally agree with the perception on urban planning. I think it's similar here in Brazil. One of my last questions, which is related to this topic of let's say paying to increase FAR, is the concept of land value capture, which is also, let's say, a new instrument used by urban planners in some cities, where governments finance public works by capturing the increase of land value after investing in large infrastructure projects. What's your opinion on it? Is it similar to the previous question in terms of pricing and how does it work, or have you seen it work?
Yes, look, land value capture, again, has been with us for decades. In fact, the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, which kind of teaches land value capture in Latin America, and you have this friend of mine, Martin Smolka, who is actually a Brazilian, who is doing these courses and teaching land value capture in Latin America for the last, 30 years maybe. This is, again, a very good idea. In fact, the Lincoln Institute was created by or donated by this gentleman called Lincoln, who was an admirer of Henry George. And Henry George was one of these, he was a socialist, and he ran for mayor of New York, I think, even at some point. His idea was that we only need a land tax. We don't even need a sales tax, and we don't need an income tax. The land tax should finance all government work, right? And he advocated a land tax, and the idea that this was a kind of a just tax, that it was progressive, that it made a lot of sense, and there's a lot of, and so that the Lincoln Institute is kind of, you might say, trying to spread these ideas about the importance of taxing land. And the problem has always been that one of separating land from structure. So if you have a property, there's a house on the land, and we know how much it costs to build a house, but maybe that was 20 years ago. It's very difficult to separate the land from the house. So it's very difficult to say what share of the property is the value of the land and what share of the property is the house. It's possible, but there's been a theoretical difference among tax experts on how to do that, right? So in general, again, land needs to be taxed in order to provide the services for that land. And the best kind of tax is the tax on the value of the land. And when you bring in new infrastructure, the value of that land increases. And therefore, whatever it is that you were going to tax should increase too. The problem with the property tax, and the reason for this Proposition 13 in California, for example, that, as you know, put a cap on the property tax. And that was devastating in terms of being able to finance infrastructure or schools or public services in California. And the problem with the property tax is that the income tax is very sensible. I make $100, you tax $40. Out of the $100, I have $60. But if I have a piece of property and you're taxing me a lot of money for the property tax, where do I pay that from? It's not possible to pay. So even people are saying, okay, you pay when you sell the property. Okay, so people sell under the table, over the table. There's a lot of corruption. People don't sell. You can actually freeze the land market. That's what happened in India when there was a land ceiling law, just land transactions just stopped because you said they were going to be taxable when things change hands. So the problem is with increasing the property tax or with this land value capture is that the people who have to pay for that don't have the means to pay for that. So that when you do have things like conversion of land from rural to urban use, you have that wonderful idea, which is available in many countries, which is when you convert land from rural to urban use, a certain percentage of that land can be claimed by the public. And so that, I think, is a very good way. And that is, by the way, how land readjustment, land pooling and readjustment works. When there is, on the periphery, there's land pooling, you pool all the land, you create roads, you subdivide it, and you give people back 60% of what they had before. 40% you use for putting in the infrastructure, and some of the land you use to sell and finance the infrastructure from that land. So when you do that properly, and it has been done done properly. It has been done properly in Germany, in Japan, in Australia, and they even have tried to do it when Modi was the chief minister in Gujarat. They even tried to do it in Gujarat in India, around Ahmedabad. So this idea of when you convert land to urban use, you take a certain area of land, pool all the landowners together, create a plan, an urban plan, give them back a certain portion of what they had before, but now it's serviced. Use the money to build the services by taking as much land as you need. So that, to me, it's difficult to do because it requires trust and it requires capability on the part of government. But if you're able to do that, that's the best way to do value capture. The only other way is the property tax. And that is higher land values command higher taxes. And then you have to have a real assessment of the property tax, which is, again, subject to a lot of political pressure, not to put it at market value, to put it at a lot lower than market value. So, but if you can put the pressure on politicians to readjust the property tax so it's more like market value, and you resist the pressure to say, well, I don't have anywhere to pay it from, then the property tax is still a very good tool for land value capture.
Oh, amazing. I loved the comparison between land value capture and land readjustment. Thank you for that. Solly, I think we covered most of the topics I had here for the interview. My last question before we move on to our, guests here listening, is to ask you about references. So what do you think are the main concepts that are missing in current housing policies, land use planning discussions? What benchmarks could Brazilian urban planners look for in other cities around the world? Because I think there is some sort of bias here to look at European cities, which are very different from Latin American cities. And what recommendations would you give to aspiring professionals in urban policy?
A couple of things. First of all, I urge planners, and I said that before, to become more familiar with the operation of land markets, of land and housing markets. You cannot really do good planning without understanding these markets. And in that sense, I want to recommend my colleague Alain Berthaud's new book, which is called Order Without Design, which is about the role of markets in urban planning. It's a very good book. It came out a couple of years ago with MIT Press, and it has a lot of interesting information in it. Now, in terms of examples for Brazil, I agree with you completely that European cities are not really the cities to emulate, and American cities, North American cities like the US and Canada are also not the cities to emulate. So what I urge Brazil to do is, just like Brazil had its own modernism in the 60s and said that this is Brazilian architecture, it's not European architecture, then Brazil has to kind of invent its own urban planning and its own urban tradition, which it already has. So I would, urge like collaboration with other Latin American countries, but there has to be a Brazilian way of doing it. It's not, I think international lessons are few and far between. The worst lesson of all is to try to learn from Singapore. Singapore is the best planned city country in the world. Everything there is planned. Every plan is properly executed. Everybody obeys the law. People save for housing and forced savings for housing, and more than 80% are accommodated in public housing. There's rapid transit that serves the entire city. There is parks and playgrounds, and the kids do very well in school, and the income per capita is higher than that of the United States. It's just not possible to copy because the Singaporeans have got their own way of doing things. It's not exactly a democracy, and people are highly disciplined. They have a great belief in what the government is doing. The government has been very good to them. So don't use Singapore as an example of how to do things in Brazil. That's an important lesson. And so I really don't see a lot of places where there are lessons to be learned. Just as an anecdote, the champion of densification in Latin America, the city that has densified the most, is Bogota. And so you'd say to yourself, oh, then should I be learning from Bogota? The answer again is no. The reason that Bogota has densified more than other cities in Latin America is because of the Civil War. The Civil War has made it impossible for Bogota to suburbanize because suburban drivers were being kidnapped and asked for ransom. And so nobody wanted to live in the suburbs and everybody moved into the city. And so the city increased its density and infilled a lot of its vacant land and is now much denser than it used to be before. But it's not because of planning policy, it's because of war and strife on the urban periphery. And now that the war has been kind of resolved, you can expect suburbanization and a decline in density in Bogota as well. So unfortunately, I don't have many kind of benchmarks or nice examples for you to follow. It's more like this city is doing this correctly, this other city is doing that correctly, and you have to kind of learn about all of them and try to distill what you need to do from a multiplicity of cities.
Solly, thank you very much. That was very enlightening, and I'm sure we will use these references. Order Without Design is a book we talk about a lot in our website, and we're even made an effort to try to translate it to Portuguese, but it's been difficult.
Really? Yeah.
Okay, let's try to, if you have time, we'll move on to a few questions from our listeners. So just to inform everyone, this was a special interview that we allowed our supporters of Caos Planejado to participate. So I'll read a few of them. So Evandro is asking, what's your opinion and experience on cross subsidies in development? So reserving part of a lot for to subsidize affordable housing, for example. I believe inclusionary zoning would fit into this type of policy.
To tell you the truth, this is the guiding policy in New York City today as we speak. Mayor de Blasio is a very great champion of this mandatory inclusionary housing, where he is negotiating deals with developers who build luxury housing to leave certain percentages of houses affordable, where affordable is kind of affordable to people who make sometimes more than $100,000 a year, but they call it affordable compared to the value of the houses in the development. This idea of cross subsidies has been with us for a very long time. I'm not a supporter of it. I'm not a supporter of it because I don't think that luxury housing and affordable housing mix very well together. You know, so if you are, I would be a lot happier if the developers contributed either land or money to projects that could then be, built at a subsidy rather than mixing the two together. I don't see the value of mixing low income and high income families together in one project.
Got it. So André says that in the past decades, urban planning received many contributions from economists, statisticians, data scientists. Do you think architects and urban planners are being left behind in the sense that they're no longer able to comprehend our city's problems?
That's a very good question. I think that when you look at the history of urban planning, the early history had a lot more involvement of architects and physical planners. And as time went by, their role was diminished. And in my way of thinking, that is a good thing, because I think that architects, and I was educated in architecture as well, because of their concern with urban form, have to be able to let go when it comes to cities. I mean, the difference between architecture and planning is when architects make a plan, that plan is a contract with the person who's going to build according to that plan. The person has to build with that plan in mind. So in a way, it's a maximalist intervention in terms of planning. I plan everything, down to the last stair, down to the last handle, down to the last brick. Urban planning is exactly the opposite. It's what is the minimum amount of restrictions or regulations or patterns patterns that I have to put in for many people to be able to build according to these patterns and regulations. So the role that the architects need to play, which is not something that they want to play, is how to create a playing field for other people to play architecture instead of them playing architecture. So the question is, who is holding the pencil? So in architecture, the whole point is to hold a pencil. In planning, the whole point is to let go of that pencil, to let somebody else hold the pencil. And so for me, the role of architecture, if you want to continue to be influential in planning, is to understand how cities are created and what you need to do for cities to be built in a way that you think they should be built, without designing them, without creating forms for them to fit into. That's not your job. Now, I want to point an exception to this rule. And again, something that architects don't understand. And that is, it's not true that markets build cities. Planners have to be there before development takes place. Planners have to be there to create the arterial grid that the city is going to develop into. And they have failed in that role. So that to the extent that planners do have a physical planning role, which is to prepare lands for occupation by the market, they have failed this role. So what I'm trying to kind of revitalize classical urban planning, namely plan the infrastructure ahead of development, and enough of it, not so that the city doesn't grow faster than what you are able to plan. And in that role, the one role that we were supposed to do, the one thing that we were supposed to do properly, which is lay out the city in advance of development, we've failed to do. And so that we need to re-educate ourselves as to what this urban planning is. Because great plans, think of the Barcelona plan, think of the Washington plan, think of the New York 1811 plan. I mean, there are plans where we were able to lay out the city in advance of development. But that, for some reason, is not interesting enough for planners and architects, or is too big for them. I don't know. But I really urge them to kind of remember what the idea was at the beginning and harness themselves into trying to do that in the future.
Excellent. Solly, are we good on time for a few more minutes?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So Mario asks about intervention in informal settlement. So you said that these interventions usually go in the inverse way, like trying to put infrastructure after housing is already consolidated. So what do you think is the most reasonable way to provide infrastructure and services to these informal urban areas?
Before answering this question, I want to point out, again, an exception. And that is, if you look at Lima, Peru, I spent a month in one of the barriadas in Lima, and it was laid out before it was occupied. And the way it was done was, this was organized by radical priests, and the invasion, it was an invasion, right? So it was organized by radical priests, and they got engineering students from St. Marcos University in Lima to go out and lay out the invasion site and leave room for 10-meter roads and then blocks with plots that were 10 meters by 20 meters along the entire invasion area. So if you go to this place, if you look at the periphery of Lima and this place I stayed, which was called Comas, you'd see that this is completely laid out before it was invaded. It was a squatter settlement. And as a result, this has really transformed into a very desirable neighborhood in Lima. And houses there on these 200-meter plots are, last time I looked, there were $180,000. So even invasions are sometimes organized and laid out before they are settled. So having said that, I also tend to agree with you that squatter settlements are often not laid out properly, and that makes it very difficult to bring in roads and to bring in services. And still, we have good experience where in a lot of places all over the world, we've been able to bring in the roads and the services. To me, an interesting question which has never been settled is the land ownership in these places. Because I think that if the community owned the land and looked at it as a real estate transaction, it would be very easy to go back to what we were talking about before, and then do land value capture improve the services in exchange for people who can build more, or people that can open shops, or people that can use the land more efficiently. So right now, I think because it's kind of divide and rule, these places are kept divided. But if they were owned by the community, and if they planned by the community, and the community says we need to improve the services, and the way to improve the services is by land value capture. The way we get land value capture is we get people to build more here. We get people that can build stores, build more housing, densify, and finance the improvements from the densification and the proper planning of these areas. For me, this is the secret, and I'm surprised that people have not been doing it yet. They keep looking at these areas as socially deficient somehow, instead of looking at them as adults and saying, you can take care of that. We can give you the support you need, the technical support you need, but you own the place, and you can use that to increase the value and to make it more productive so that you can reap the benefits of the fact that you have very good land in a very accessible place in the city.
That's an excellent perspective. So in Brazil, just a quick comment. In Brazil, I think we are very much behind land formalization project, and even when they happen, the land titles are usually not full for the land property owners, and they come with a lot of restrictions on what property owners that were formalized can or cannot do in market transactions.
Yeah, I would, again, Anthony, what I would recommend is other models, rather than kind of individual land titles and so on, kind of more like cooperative models where there's kind of common ownership of the structures and the public areas and so on, and make these cooperatives powerful, and then give people shares in the cooperatives for their plots, right? But empower these people as a group, organize them and empower them as a group somehow to act together to improve the community as a whole, not to just worry about their own land title.
Got it. I think Alain Berthaud writes about the kampong, maybe similar to what you're saying. Okay, so there's one last question by Gustavo. He's asking about, is there a way to, his concern is on height limits on buildings as a resident of Rio de Janeiro. So his perception is that Copacabana is a good example of walkability, accessibility, but the neighborhoods cast a shadow on the beach, and he reports that there is not a lot of natural ventilation in the buildings, and this, let's say, decreases his quality of life. That's my perception here. And I think his question is regarding would you advocate for a restriction to provide those amenities?
I'm reluctant to answer this question because this is really a problem of the rich, not of the poor. If you were offered an apartment overlooking the beach in the Copacabana instead of the little apartment that you have somewhere in Rosinia, you just move there and you don't ask yourself too many questions about whether there's a shadow on the beach or not. So I think that I would not like to restrict buildings because they put shadows on other areas. I don't have any problem with shadows. There are places where you can build as high as you need to build. There's no reason to restrict it, and it is in a good location, and a lot of people want to live there. And I don't think that that is kind of a great infringement on your quality of life. I think it's all relative. But just, in Berkeley, for example, there's the regulation that says that you can build in the backyard, you can build another unit. And then the next door neighbors are objecting because it throws a shadow on their vegetable garden. Yeah, it does throw a shadow on their vegetable garden. So what, right? But so is that a good enough reason not to allow the densification of residential area in Berkeley because some vegetable garden is getting some shade? No, it's not. So again, then what I'm encouraging you to think about is what I said before, and that is there has to be some kind of a calculus. It's not absolute. Yes, you build on larger plot coverage, you build taller buildings, they create shadows. There are less air and less sunshine into the rooms. That is true. How does it compare with issues of affordability, with issues of accessibility to jobs, with issues of protecting the environment? What is the calculus here? You need to do the calculations. If you can show that the cost of creating a shadow is actually higher than the cost of the fact that housing is not affordable, then go ahead. But I don't believe in kind of single issue advocacy where somebody says, well, if there's a storm, we need the drainage. Or no, it's going to create shadows, like end of discussion. It's not the end of the discussion. It's the beginning of the discussion. Yes, it creates shadows. What does it do to improve things? What does it do to repair the city, to add value to the city? So I think that as planners and as architects, you should be very alert to this calculus. It's not about being a champion of one issue. It's about trying to bring into balance a whole complex set of issues that make living in the city so exciting.
Solly, I think that answer is a great way to finalize our interview. I enjoyed it very much. I would like to thank you again for accepting this invitation, and I hope we can keep connected in the future.
Good, thank you. I enjoyed it myself too. Good talking to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much. Na descrição desse episódio, você encontra o link para as referências citadas ao longo da conversa. E se você gostou desse conteúdo e é um amante de cidades, seja apoiador do Caos Planejado. Visite caosplanejado.com para conferir centenas de artigos e todo o conteúdo que produzimos e faça uma doação para apoiar o nosso trabalho, para nos ajudar a levar essa conversa a um número cada vez maior de pessoas. Com doações a partir de R$ 25 por mês, você participa ao vivo das gravações do podcast, tem acesso ao nosso grupo exclusivo no WhatsApp, a nossa biblioteca virtual com centenas de artigos e muitas outras vantagens. A nossa edição de som é feita pelo Cristiano Botafogo. Obrigado por ouvir o podcast Caos Planejado e espero vocês no próximo episódio.